I had the great pleasure of working with Frances Haskell in Oxford, and that is very much at the root of my continuing exploration of this question of visualizing history in European painting. That is to invoke the theme of this particular session. Visualizing history in European painting, of course, required artists to render historical costumes. And these costumes, as we've heard from several papers earlier today, became a primary signifier, perhaps along with architecture, of a subject and a very important index of the supposed accuracy of its representation. Now, despite their importance, costumes' means of evoking history and their relation to the narrative structure of the subjects they illustrated have received a little attention in the scholarly literature. And my purpose today is to explore the role played by historical costume in Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres's historical genre paintings. Although Ingres is, of course, primarily known as a classicist, he was, I would argue, the most interesting painter of early modern costume in France. That's quite a claim to make, and why do I make it? I would say that Ingres' depiction of historical costumes is visually more striking than it is in most paintings in this genre because he exploited the costumes for their pictorial effect. And I offer as my a case in point, there we go, his Death of Leonardo da Vinci, in which I would say costumes really steal the show. Francis I's chestnut velvet coat and fur collar, his slashed pink jerkin and white hose take center stage, literally framed by a red canopied bed with curtains drawn back as if to reveal him. The king's richly colored costume also stands out against the white bed linens, which seem to swallow Leonardo up, merging with his bloodless white skin, his flowing white beard, his billowing white nightshirt. Now, visually, this treatment of the subject reversed the traditional priorities of the deathbed scene, which was supposed to concentrate on the worth of the dying man and the ethical reflections provoked by his death. The dying Leonardo da Vinci, famous though he was, is less the pictorial focus of this painting than his chief mourner, Francis I. Now, Vasari's account of the episode justified Ingres' focus on the king, and doubtless his staunchly royalist patron approved of this. And yet, in this artist's hands, the visual display of costume is more important than the exemplum virtutis of the subject. And if there were any doubt about that, the figure of the young boy at right reinforces it. His lavish attire, we have here slashed gold. He holds a purse, an embroidered purse and gloves. This is the attire of a prince who appears to be receiving a lesson in virtue. But this boy turns out to be a nobody, merely a page transformed into a clothes horse for the purposes, the visual needs of the composition, to counterbalance the luxury of the king's costume. Early modern costume provided Ingres with an occasion for exploiting chromatic effects, and this is perhaps the most interesting and surprising aspect of his genre paintings. Compared with the muted palettes of ancient history painting, it was him that really introduction of vivid hues and strong contrasts into his art. His enthusiastic study of ancient, historical costume, and his tendency to color it up spoke to his belief that the history of ancient France had more to offer in this respect than classical Greece and Rome. And I quote Engra, "Reading Montfaucon, I am convinced that the history of old France from the time of Saint Louis and others would be a new vein to exploit, that the costumes were then very attractive, and some of them resemble the fashion of the Greeks, that even those which appear bizarre only do so on account of the weak art by which they have come down to us, that beautiful heads, beautiful bodies, beautiful attitudes, beautiful gestures are timeless." The passage shows that costume was a pivotal factor in Engra's reflections on the aesthetic appeal of early modern subjects, and he turned to it as a new resource for painting. The expressive potential of costume was especially pronounced in Engra's art by his use of local color, a method of coloring that confined a hue to an individual object and relied on hues to differentiate forms from each other. And incidentally, this approach, which exploited the effect of juxtaposing areas of strongly defined local color, this was quite different from the painterly style of Romanticism associated with Delacroix, which approached color in terms of reflections and the transformative effects of light and space. One of Engra's reflections on color, which you see here on the screen, indicates that he conceived of composition in terms of local color. And I quote, "And distinguish especially a blonde color next to the brown and colored figures by their local hues, their teinte locale." He put that observation to work in Henri IV, Playing with His Children, where the hues of costumed figures gain luster by contrast with the muted interior around them, or what he called elsewhere, the ensemble of masses and blacks. Engra said that he liked true and strong color, couleur vraie et forte, when it came to costuming figures in his genre paintings. The visceral effect of his use of local color is plain to see in Henry IV, Playing with His Children. Here, shades of red and purple, accented by yellow and green, alleviate a background that is a muted burgundy setting, and then contrasting colors of reds and greens in the painting play off against the quite different saturated hues of its pendant, The Death of Leonardo da Vinci. These are very studied color schemes, and they pose a visual and conceptual problem that is typical of many anecdotal genre paintings of the period, namely, what should the viewer focus on in them? It's difficult to know where to look because the small figures are evenly spread across the canvas, and the colors and textures of their costumes keep the eye moving, jumping between them, sometimes pausing to dwell on a particular effect. The overall visual effect is disjointed and sensuous. Costumes have a dual effect in these paintings. They distract the eye, and that's one reason that academic art theorists were so suspicious of them. And yet they also give the paintings much of their visual interest. Now, I have been discussing local color in its original technical, artistic, or pictorial sense. But that connotation was gradually overtaken during the first decades of the 19th century by a literary sense of the term local color, which referred to the local atmosphere, the dialect, customs, costumes, architecture, and so forth of a particular era or physical geographic location. And Engra's work also participated in this second literary connotation of local color, which is most evident in his concern with the accuracy of his representation of historical costumes. He went to considerable length to play to the contemporary taste for accuracy or vérité historique. He referenced iconic artworks whenever he could, since these constituted the consensual basis for judging authenticity. Titian's portrait of Francis I, then hanging in the Louvre, gave him the king's outfit and strict profile for the death of Leonardo da Vinci, and he made, as you see on the screen, precise notes on the colors and fabrics of the king's costume in a preparatory drawing. Raphael's Castiglione portrait lent him the costume of the black-clad mourner in the same painting, and so forth. In fact, Ingres lamented the difficulties of obtaining visual documentation for French national subjects. This is an issue that Maria Trucheva was telling us that Zabelin also drew attention to, the difficulty of obtaining a visual documentation. And for Ingres, this was a particular challenge because he was living in Italy at the time he began making many of these anecdotal genre paintings. His choice of anecdotal subjects from Italian history may have been predicated on his ease of access to historical documents. For example, the very unusually young figure of Aretino portrayed in his Aretino and the Envoy from Charles V was closely based on a 17th century engraving, supposedly after Titian. This print was readily available to him in Rome, though it appears not to have been well known in France until the early 20th century, surprisingly. Ingres used his imagination to pull his very exacting research together, and he created his own wardrobe of historical costumes. Hardly any of the clothes he painted repeat the whole outfit or pose of his source figures. The example of the young Aretino you're looking at represents an exception to this rule, actually. Yet most of his costumes exude historical accuracy, as critics noted at the time and have since, because they were fabricated out of his in-depth study of the period's material culture. He used Montfaucon's volumes on the monuments of the French monarchy the same way that he used Caylus' Recueil d'Antiquités Égyptiennes, Étrusques, Grecques, Romaines et Gauloises, or Montfaucon's volumes on antiquity, or other illustrated costume repertoire of the early 19th century, that is, as sources of historical truth for representing artifacts from a given culture. And we've just heard from Isabel the importance of illustrated graphic sources for this pursuit of authenticity. Ingres, for example, drew fragmentary, and I emphasize that word fragmentary, sketches of 14th century costumes from different figures in 4 or 5 plates in Montfaucon. And then he synthesized these bits and pieces into whole new costumes for his paintings. In this case, the painting is the entry of the Dauphin, later Charles V, into Paris. While the outfits that Ingres created do not look exactly like any of the engraved figures, they look enough like many of them. Most of the time, Ingres' visual sources, as in the case of Montfaucon, were black and white engravings, and they gave him a certain latitude to devise color schemes for costumes. His primary visual source for Henry IV playing with his children was a 17th century engraving, Gautier's Henri IV et sa famille, which Ingres dismembered by tracing the individual figures and then moving them around into a new arrangement. He then proceeded to consult iconic sources for the king's and queen's costumes and for the red hose of the ambassador. But he followed his own inclinations when it came to coloring the children's bright red, green, and yellow outfits and the ambassador's salmon and violet jerkin and green trunk hose. The colors that Éngra favored were heightened in range and barely nuanced by shading or aerial perspective. Critics were not entirely wrong when they accused Éngra of looking Gothic, since his method of painting with local color and sharp tonal contrast approximated the method employed by Quattrocento painters. One might even say that he painted early modern costumes more accurately than his contemporaries did, because he presented them as he imagined them stylistically to have been in an earlier era. Now, Éngra certainly used costume in a conventional way, that is to identify and characterize his actors, but he also, much more unusually, activated the color of clothing as an expressive element in the narrative. The costumes in his Aretino pendants seem to register strong emotion through color. The vividly colored figures in them are, respectively, the pink-robed Aretino, who Éngra described as frightened, and the yellow-caped envoy from Charles V, who he described as incensed, whereas the black-clad figures have the upper hand emotionally in each scene. Aretino appears in both paintings, but rather than maintain sartorial identity across them, as an iconographically minded painter would have done, Éngra altered the poet's costume to indicate his mood and state. The lavishly dressed pink-robed Aretino is, according to Éngra, mystified and frightened by Tintoretto, who had invited him into his studio for a portrait sitting, only to take his measure with a pistol. The sternly dressed Aretino rejects the bribe of a gold chain that Charles V hoped would silence his pen. Color speaks in lieu of words. The ability of color to assume an affective role in Éngra's genre paintings was contingent on the non-dramatic nature of the episodes he depicted. One of the major challenges posed by the anecdotal historical subjects for painting was their wordiness. They often feature a bon mot, an oral exchange between characters that was hard to translate into the pictorial language of gesture and expression. It's difficult to know what is taking place in many of these scenes without prior knowledge of the subject or the assistance of a text, which artists often provided in exhibition catalogs, as you see here. The bon mot in Éngra's painting of the ambassador is Aretino's disdainful rejection of Charles V's gift, offered to silence his criticism of the emperor's recent military defeat in Tunis, and I quote, "That is certainly a very small gift," Aretino says, "for such great foolhardiness." We would never know from the painting that this was being said, or that it elicited outrage, because the ambassador's body registers no emotion. His back is turned toward us, we cannot see his face, and the only hint of anger is his hand gripping his sword. The expression of emotion conventionally enacted by pose, gesture, and facial expression has been transferred to his glowing yellow cape and shimmering white hose. And Éngra evidently banked on this sartorial speech act by adopting a back view of this incensed figure. Historical costumes were fungible elements in Éngra's art. He reclothed figures in different iterations of a subject and did so for different reasons. In the case of his Aretino pendants, he changed the costumes and other features in his later variants of the subjects in order to make them original. That is, to reassure his patron, and I quote, of all the things that are not anywhere in the first versions. The outfit of the poet, he wrote, the outfit of the poet is a different fabric, he wrote the patron, and indeed it is. It's black velvet rather than pink satin, lined with gray rather than white fur, and differently belted than in the 1815 version. Éngra had already changed the fabric of Aretino's costume in an early watercolor, inventing a figured silk robe for the poet that recombined elements from the two different garments he wears in early versions of the painting. Éngra constantly played around with early modern costume, creating original variants by altering a few historically justified details. Artists' ability to repeat and yet vary these subjects conformed to the larger contours of the production of art and material culture in the 19th century. The familiarity of subjects encouraged their variation in artworks, and this pattern of theme and variation occurred in other spheres as well. Éngra's interest in a variety of striking chromatic effects in his painting should be situated in the context of his own culture's interest in contemporary fashion, in which color played a major role. Printed patterns were on the rise for adorning fabrics and put color at the forefront of textile design, with different colorways, as you see on the left, employed to generate variations in the same pattern. Colormen and chemists became key innovators in the manufacture and finishing of textiles, and they competed internationally to provide printers with new dye stuffs and processes. Charts of many colors were published in the domains of wearable fashion. Here is 161 color bars of do's and don'ts on how to wear color. Textile manufacture and art manuals for amateurs. All these publications indicate a kind of restless agitation around color in the early 19th century. These strainings to find new combinations of color for dress, for textiles, for art, pushed natural dye stuffs and pigments to their limits. This was roughly analogous to what Éngra was doing with color. It was how he used color that created startling effects, effects that both harmonized with his conceptualizing of historical subjects and made a strong impact on the viewer as pictorial values in their own right. Thank you. Sorry that I've run right to the limit here. So now I need to, Maria, am I correct? Get out of my PowerPoint. Stop sharing screen. From where Éngra drew his associations between certain colors in particular, was he interested? Okay, so the question is from where did Enger draw his association between colors and particular moods and attitudes? Was he interested in contemporary color theory, e.g. Goethe, or was it a personal set of associations? From Patricia Smith. Thank you, Patricia. I would say that it was a personal set of associations. The codification of color and its meaning changes. It's so variable in different periods and in different cultures. And in this time, it is beginning to change rapidly, even as it's being codified. So it's very hard to find a kind of stable reference there. I don't know to what extent he was aware of color theories. He probably was aware of Mérimée, for example, and some other French theorists, and certainly was very interested in buying particular pigments. We know something about his pigment purchase from merchants. Dear Susan, thank you. A question, did Enger borrow inspiration from theatrical performances, or did he primarily rely on engravings and other visual materials? He relied primarily on engravings, and this partly had to do with the fact that he left Paris in 1806 and stays there until the mid-1820s. When he comes back to Paris, as far as we know, he did attend theatrical productions and, of course, historical dramas. Walter Scott, chief among them, are everywhere on the French stage, but he doesn't talk about that to the extent that, let us say, David, his master, did, who was very, very tied into the theatrical presentation of costumes. It might be said that theatrical costume designers such as Planchet, the Englishman Planchet, were really at the forefront of doing his research on the historical reconstruction of costume for the stage. And so many artists, the Pre-Raphaelites, for example, draw their inspiration from theatrical productions rather more than from engraved illustration. But Enger was, in that sense, had his foot in the 18th century and was very dependent and interested in, consumed engraved illustrations, went to study Andrea del Sarto's frescoes in situ and made notes on the colors and the costumes of works, whether in Paris or Rome. The link to the textile industry is enlightening. What about the link with fashion and or the development of fancy dress? Fantastic question, Isabel, thank you. There's a lot, and I was actually very interested in the talk on the carousel of was it Catherine II's carousel, as an example of a kind of courtly performance of quadrille and historical masquerade. There are many artists who are drawing connections between fancy dress, which I regard as a kind of laboratory almost for the taking up of historical motifs in contemporary fashion. If you look at fashion journals like La Mode or the Journal des Dames et des Modes, one can see that the costumes that are being produced for fancy dress, which is revived in Paris from really under the Bourbon Restoration and especially in the 1820s and 30s, that these costumes are more extreme, more fanciful than the degree to which those costumes enter into historicized fashion. And there is certainly an overlap. The fashion journals are reporting on the costumes worn at fancy dress. The plates are being reproduced side by side. The same publishers are printing series of plates and series of separate plates specifically for the masquerade season, masquerade ball season. Thank you.